A legend passed down among many Native American tribes is that of the battle of the bear and the deer. The bear was proud and selfish. He was easily made angry and often caused much trouble amongst the animals of the Great Council. One day, the deer had been seen crossing the great Rainbow Bridge to the Skyland. The deer was not permitted to do this, and it angered the bear. So, the bear confronted the deer and asked him why he had done this. The two of them exchanged words, and a fight began. The deer raised its head, showing its antlers to the bear, and a fire burned within its eyes. The bear stood strong, and his roar echoed through the forests like thunder. The bear dug his mighty claws into the deer, and the deer stabbed his sharpened antlers into the bear. The rest of the animals of the Great Council had all heard of the commotion, and the wolf came to stop the battle. All of the animals of the council had to listen to the wolf, and after the bear and the deer had seen the wolf, they both fled in opposite directions. As the deer ran, the blood of the bear fell from his antlers to the lower world beneath. It landed upon the trees and changed their colors. Some were crimson, some were yellow, some brown, and some tan. Now, it is said that every autumn, the trees remember this battle. They remember the leaves being stained with the blood of the bear, and they change every year. Each year the leaves turn, and they die, just as everything is meant to die. There is a festival known as the Festival of Reason that is held once every 12 years among the Susquehannock peoples and other neighboring tribes. Every 12 years, the bodies of those that had passed during that period would be brought out of their tombs in the cemeteries and would be delivered into a building together. There, the surviving relatives would begin to mourn the passing of their loved ones again, their grief returning anew, just as it was the day of their funeral. This was not a festival for just single tribes. The tribes of the area would all come together in peace, all of them bringing their dead as well, to mourn and celebrate their dead together. And together, they would feast with their tribesmen, both alive and dead. The entire process lasted several days, and in the end, the dead were wrapped in blankets and animal skins, and a mass grave was dug. Here, all of the bodies would be placed inside, before they were covered beneath a great burial mound. It is said that on the final day of the Festival of Reason, there was a young girl at about the age of 12. She was collecting flowers near the lake, a lake that would later be named for the swarms of locusts that gathered around it every so many years, Locust Lake. The girl was being stalked, however. 2 young men of another tribe had been following her. They had stalked her through a forest nearby, shaded by thick canopy, and down into an open field. She picked flowers along the way as she approached the lake, but when she reached the lake's edge, the 2 men jumped into action. Together, the men forced themselves upon the girl, the 2 of them with nefarious intentions in mind and in action. One of them pulled out a crude knife fashioned from the antler of a deer. The girl struggled against them, screaming desperately for help. During the struggle, the girl fell against the man with a deer antler knife, and the knife accidentally plunged into her torso. She quickly fell down into the water. The men soon stopped and realized what they'd done. The girl was now lying face down in the water. A pool of red began to form around her as she floated there. The 2 men panicked and ran back to the festival. They pretended nothing happened, but before the end of the festival, the girl's body would be found. The girl's mother had left the village to look for her daughter. She made her way down the hill and through the same shaded woods. Soon, the lake came into view, and from a distance, the girl's mother could see a figure within the water. In a panic, the woman ran through the field toward the lake, diving into the water in a desperate attempt to save her daughter, but her daughter was already dead. The woman held her young daughter's lifeless body and cried over her, screaming in pain at her great loss. She stayed there in the lake, holding her daughter close to her until the festival was over. She cried over her daughter's body all night until they were found the next day via a party of hunters from the village. The poor woman was pained too greatly to speak, and no one knew what happened to the girl, save for the 2 young men that had killed her. But they were long gone with their tribesmen, and they weren't going to reveal their secret. The tribe prepared the funeral of the girl for the mother, for she was too distressed to do anything. The girl was wrapped in blankets and animal skins and placed within the tomb of the cemetery. The great mourning would follow. It was customary for the family of the deceased to mourn for 10 days as they lay wrapped in a blanket face down on their bed mats, very much like the deceased relative in their tomb. They would not speak to anyone that came to visit them for a full 10 days, for their pain was great. Then, after the 10 days were over, they would begin to speak to others again, but would continue to mourn the loss of their loved ones for a full year. However, the mother of this girl was completely devastated. She did not follow the normal way of mourning the dead. Instead, she would visit the lake every day and spend much of the day there, half submerged in the water where her daughter had died. The woman barely ate or drank anything, and she spoke to no one. When it came time for her to return to her normal life in the tribe, she did not. She instead continued to return to the lake where her daughter spent her last moments. Over time, the tribe began to view her as a disturbed individual, a woman that had lost her will, a woman who had lost her own spirit with the spirit of her daughter that night of the Festival of Reason. The tribe began to call her Akenefti Oniga, or Lady of the Water. She spent every day within the lake, not speaking a word. Every day she returned to that spot. Every day for 12 years, until the day had come. The day of the Festival of Reason. On that particular anniversary, the woman, grown a little feebler with age, had a strong urge to remain away from the festival. She knew that on this day, her daughter's killers would once again visit the water's edge. She couldn't bear to endure such an emotionally stressful event. That day, the old woman stayed in the village, just on the other side of the shaded woods, while the rest of the tribe attended the festival at Locust Lake. The sounds of the ceremony echoed through the forest and across the valley. This made it easy for the woman to identify when the festival had ended. She watched as the rest of her village returned home, smiles adorned upon their faces, still pleased from the recent festivities. She couldn't stand it. Once every member of the tribe had fallen asleep, the grief-stricken woman crept from the village and down into the shaded woods. The night was starlit, and it was highlighted by identifiable details of the lush autumn forest, making it quite easy for the woman to see. She had lived here her entire life, however, and could have completed her trek blind. She followed the trail through the dense woods, halfway down the mountainside, and to the glistening dark waters of the lake. She placed one naked foot into the water's edge and submerged it below the crisp surface, planting it into the muck beneath. Then, the other. The woman waded into the lake waist deep, profoundly sobbing with her face in her hands, tears dripping to the surface and mixing with the lake water. She pleaded. She begged from the bottom of her soul to the forest spirits to provide justice for her daughter and bring an end to her own suffering. For hours, shivering in the water in the dead of night, the woman kept with her grieving. Through the sounds of her weeping and rapid gasps for air, she heard something not too far away, a sound not typical of her environment. However, it sounded as if it were coming from the center of the lake. The woman removed her hands from her face and peered out into the darkness. The sound was distinct. Whatever it was definitely out in the lake, but too far away for the old sobbing woman's eyes. Suddenly, she was able to associate it with something else. It was a bubbling, like that of bringing water to a rolling boil over an open fire. Straining her eyes, she could finally make out the source of the sound, but only as the figure began to rise from it. It seemed to emerge from the depths of the lake up to its waist, and then proceeded to move towards her, as if either floating in the water or having extremely long, unnatural legs. When it had gotten close enough, the woman was able to gain one detailed, unforgettable glance at the creature before her world went black. She lifted up her hands to her eyes, stared up at the dust. Excuse me. She lifted her hands up to her eyes, stared up at the starry night, but saw nothing but blackness. She had been stricken blind. The sloshing sounds of the thing in the water, moving ever closer to her, could be easily heard by her now probing ears. She began to shake with fear, unsure if what she had glimpsed was the truth. It wasn't until it had moved past her that she accepted it, rejoicing that her prayers had been answered. In that single moment that she landed sight on the being, now heard leaving the water's edge, she had sworn she had recognized it as her daughter. Sure, her flesh had become rotten and swollen with water, her eyes a ghastly shade of yellow, and her face expressed with a sinister, insane smile that stretched across its diameter, revealing rotten green and brown teeth. But it was her daughter. This, of course, was impossible, as she had been dead and buried over a decade ago at the edge of the village. But she had still been wearing the same dress that she had been murdered in, the same dress that she had been buried in when she arose from the lake. The woman, known to her tribe as Akenefti Oniga, began fumbling her way out of the water and to the shore. A smile graced her face. She felt assured that her daughter had been raised so as to exact revenge on her killers. As described previously, she was more than capable of finding her way back to the village without her sense of sight. With only a few minor bumps and trips, she had made it through the entrance of her abode. A satisfied smile on her face, she began looking for a place to lie down. And that's when her vision returned. Only, it wasn't her vision. She was seeing through the eyes of her deceased, yet reanimated daughter. Although she didn't quite know this at first, she realized what was happening when she saw a frail and rotted hand, signified by necrosis, holding up a small knife. The woman stopped all intentional movement and began to shake, especially when she caught sight of a sleeping Native American man beside a dying fire. She didn't want to watch, but it wasn't like she had a choice. It wasn't like she could shut her eyes. She was blinded, yet also connected to whatever it was that she had brought back. She watched as the man opened his eyes, slowly at first, and then instantly wide with fear. She watched his mouth stretch out so as to let out a powerful scream, but there was no sound to be heard, only the quiet of night that encompassed her in her actual surroundings. The man jumped to his feet and attempted to run. The eyes she was now looking through seemed to fly about the air at an excessively fast speed, only to catch up with the man in an instant. He kicked and flailed for escape, but the rotten hand never even flinched in its resolve to hold on to the thick hair on his skull. With a quick motion of the other hand, Akinifty-Oniga watched her resurrected daughter reach around the man's forehead with a small knife and began slicing into his flesh. As she began to pull his hair back, red, sticky blood and sinew began to reveal themselves. The man began to struggle more violently. It was then, with her daughter's hand held dead still, that he attempted to just run off, tearing his scalp from his neck. The Lady of the Water watched the man run only about 4 steps before collapsing and writhing on the ground, ever slowing his movements. The long black hair connected to a bloody piece of flesh still hanging in the night air from her daughter's hand. Then, once again, her sight went solid black. Terrified by the images that she had just seen, fearing what she had possibly unleashed, the woman let out a powerful scream so forceful it brought nearly every able-bodied tribe member to her side. The first oddity each of them noticed was her blind eyes, now gone snow white. She explained to them what had happened and what she had seen. The chief was the most concerned, fearing that this grieving woman may have cursed herself, the land, or the entire tribe. He was in the middle of deliberating his concerns when her sight returned. This time, the resurrected beast had already apparently obtained her prey. Another young man, slightly shorter than the last, could be seen bound to a tree in the dead of night, struggling and seemingly begging for his freedom. She watched the man's mouth stretch open, and his head turned violently with each movement of his mouth. He was trying to call for help. And then, a festering, decaying hand, holding a broken stick slightly larger than the man's mouth, was viewed being raised into sight. When the man's mouth next opened for a shout, the other hand reached forward and kept open his jaw, just before the first jammed the branch deep into his mouth, cracking a few teeth and identifiably dislocating his jaw. The creature's sight turned downward to the man's waist and focused as the decaying right hand reached out for the hilt of his hunting knife. The woman began to cry and then laugh. She could feel the disapproving eyes of her tribe upon her, but she cared not. She knew that justice was being delivered. Akinifty-Oniga happily chuckled to herself, explaining in detail what she was seeing, delightfully watching her daughter gut the man alive and pull his innards free for the animals to claim. Her satisfaction had been reached when she watched the glowing light of life leave his dying eyes. When her vision returned to nothing but its former blackness, she listened on as the tribe decided what to do. For the time being, they would leave her to herself in her own shelter and discuss amongst each other the next course of preferable action. This would likely take a few days. For the Woman of the Water, she had made up her mind long before that. It was the following night. just after the village had resigned themselves to sleep yet again. She would attempt to take the situation into her own hands. Once darkness had been upon them, while the tribe was still preparing to retire for night, Ekinifty-Oniga watched her home intently while the others scurried about. She watched motionlessly while the others had finally entered the unconsciousness of sleep. She was out there, just on the edge of the village, and the woman knew that she had come for her. She had been watching her residence for hours, like a statue. Once she was certain that she wouldn't be followed, Ekinifty-Oniga quietly walked outside, watching herself approach her daughter in their shared vision. She walked up to her, reached out her hand, and begged her to return herself to rest. An eternity passed in a moment. Neither one of them was moving. Not until her daughter had plunged a small knife into her abdomen, causing her to double over in pain and then fall to the forest floor. She thought to herself that if she could just get back to the water, just beg the spirits one last time, she may be able to end all this and return her daughter to peace. The woman cried in pain, watching herself drag her own body forward in her daughter's eyes, following just behind her, never gaining or losing an inch. The woman crawled into the shaded woods that separated her from the lake, the twigs on the forest floor digging and tearing at her wound. The pain was so intense, the woman began shouting out in agony as she slithered across the leaves and sticks. Her voice carried back to the village and awoke its residents. As they listened on to the screaming in the distance, they gathered their things and began trekking off into the direction that they had heard the wailing. The Lady of the Water had the water of the lake in sight by the time the pursuing members of her tribe made it to the darker portion of the forest. Blood stained the forest floor and bases of the trees, making an easily traceable path in which to follow her. The woman slid herself into the water, now clinging to life, the weightlessness of her body embraced by the support of submersion. The water became stained with thick red as she leaked out into the lake beneath a moonlit sky. She wept, watching her own self get closer through her daughter's eyes. The woman begged the spirits for forgiveness, to rescind her previous requests. Her prayers went unheard. The tribe arrived at the water's edge just in time to see the rotted girl reach out into her mother's stomach wound with 2 decayed hands and rip her open, with an insane glimmer upon the dead girl's face and a look of everlasting love on her mother's. The tribe stood upon the lake shore as they watched the 2 of them sink below the surface in each other's arms. A feud between the tribes nearly ensued as a result of the incident, but eventually, through ceremonies and offers of friendship, war would be avoided. The Susquehannock peoples remained in the area for some time, but eventually moved on and away from those mountains and those woods. If you talk to devout descendants of the Susquehannock people, they'll tell you the tribe abandoned the area because the land had become tainted. The mutilated corpses were never removed from the lake. Animal life seemed to dwindle, and the tribe experienced a series of unspeakable events. It is said that her constant remorse, her daily grief at the lake, brought about a curse upon herself that leaked into the water and the surrounding land through her spilled blood. The lake and land itself remembering the tragedy that befell it so many years ago, much like the trees remember the battle of the bear and the deer. They say that Ekinifty-Oniga was never recovered because her spirit is still there, alive in the water and surrounding forest. telling you all this now because another 12 years has passed by at Locust Lake, and the time for resurrecting past tragedies is upon us once again. Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.